Women Studies Group. Thank you, Jeremy, sir, and Canada Knowledge Center. So we are thrilled to have over 116 participants from 38 countries. Yay, with us today. So your presence across different time zones reflect the collective urgency of this conversation and the power of global solidarity. So some housekeeping notes. We initially communicated that this event won't be recorded, but due to the significance of discussion and requests for wider access, we have decided to record the session. So our goal is to ensure that these critical conversations are reaching more people. However, we deeply respect your privacy. So if you're not comfortable being on camera, you're welcome to engage via voice or use the chat instead. We also apply a GBA plus or gender-based analysis plus lens to ensure that this conversation is inclusive, intersectional, and diverse, acknowledging how different experiences and identities shape access to education. We will be dropping the full agenda and speaker bios in the chat, so feel free to check them out and engage accordingly. Please take a moment to introduce yourself in the chat, drop your name and where you're joining from. It's always inspiring to see the global reach of our discussions. So, and if you haven't already grabbed, please grab a cup of tea or coffee, get comfortable and settle in. So today is about more than just making International Women's Day. It's about practicing solidarity, amplifying voices, and committing to action. So at EDN, we believe that education is one of the most powerful tools for breaking barriers, dismantling oppression, and creating real opportunities. Our work is dedicated to advocating for education equity, shaping policies, and amplifying the voices of those most affected by systematic exclusion. So this year's STEM Accelerating Action for Gender Equity is at the heart of today's discussion. And how do we move beyond acknowledging injustice and actively pushing for change? That's the question that we're going to explore and brainstorm today. So our agenda for today, we have a powerful lineup ahead. So first, I'm excited to introduce our two incredible hosts, my co-hosts for today, who will help guide us through today's conversation, Marufa, Shabnam, and Julia. So both all three of them inspiring voices in advocacy and education. Next, we will be having our key speaker, Shabana, to share her perspective on gender apartheid and the urgent need for action from Afghanistan. After that, I'll hand it over to the amazing Julia, who will be handling our panel discussion with incredible speakers, bringing their expertise and lived experiences to the table. She will also facilitate the Q&A and key takeaways, making sure that we leave today with real actions to take forward. So let's dive in. Marufa and Shabnam, floor is yours.
Can I move ahead?
Yes, please.
Thank you so much. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. It's an honor to be here. Thank you so much for having me. On behalf of the Canadian Global Knowledge Center, I welcome you all to this important discussion today on the urgent need for education and dismantling gender apartheid and driving global action. At the center, we strive to foster inclusive social change by leveraging knowledge and skills as powerful tools for building resilience and also creating equitable communities. On this International Women's Day, we celebrate the achievements and courage of women all over the world. Yet, it is equally important to recognize the ongoing challenges and struggles that many women, particularly in conflict-affected countries like Afghanistan and similar contexts, continue to face access to their fundamental rights. These injustices are not isolated. They reflect broader systemic barriers to gender equality. As we reflect on the 76 years since the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 45 years of the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, and 29 years of Beijing Platform for Action, it is important to highlight that the fight against gender apartheid and gender inequality is not just one for a specific region, but it's a universal challenge and demands a global action. While our focus today is on gender apartheid, we cannot overlook the growing resistance to equity and inclusion efforts in many Western countries. This backlash serves as a reminder that the struggle for gender equality must be upheld both in conflict zones and democratic nations. Our work today is just as important and as relevant to the Western countries as it is to countries like Afghanistan. As we discuss the role of education in dismantling gender apartheid, we must remember that education is not just a right, it is an equalizer and a powerful equalizer. It is critical to empowering marginalized communities, including those facing discrimination based on gender, indigeneity, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, and more. It is vital to recognize that women and girls experience these barriers differently depending on their intersecting identities, and solutions must reflect these complexities. This is what we do at the center. We preserve the indigenous knowledge of our experts while providing context-oriented and solution-based education to our audience, starting with women and girls in Afghanistan. At this critical time, we must amplify the voices of those being silenced because we stand on the shoulders of those who have fought tirelessly for women's rights and gender equality. And we honor their sacrifices in pursuit of a more just and equitable world. As we move forward in this important conversation, I'd like to thank you again for having me in this important discussion, and I wish you all the best for the rest of the conversation. Now I will hand over to Ms. Marufa. Thank you.
Hello? Do you
Yes,
have
we
my
can hear you, Dr. Shinwari, please.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for having me. I would like to read the Women and Gender Studies group in Afghanistan, their message. We would like to extend our warmest congratulations to all on International Women's Day, a day symbolizes resistance, strength, and the ongoing struggle for justice and equality. Today, we are together to discuss a crucial theme of accelerating action, advancing gender equity, and supporting the fight against gender apartheid. We acknowledge that progress cannot wait across globe. Women and girls are facing systematic barriers and limit their potential. But nowhere in this struggle more urgent than in Afghanistan. Afghan women have been systematically stripped from their most basic human right, denied access to education, barred from workplace, excluded from political participation, and even restricted in their freedom of movement. The severity of this restriction has created a system of gender apartheid where women are deliberately erased from public life. However, we are here today because we refuse to remain silent. We are here to demand action, not just a word. We must ensure that the world does not look away as Afghan women are forced into isolation and oppression. Advanced gender equity means breaking down barriers, challenge oppressive system, and taking concrete steps to build a more just and inclusive society. It means recognize that women's right is our human right, and that no society can progress with half its population is denied basic freedoms. When women thrive, community prosper, economy grow, and nation becomes stronger. But this cannot happen without bold action, strong policies, and global solidarity. It is our collective responsibility to advocate for change, to push for policies that uplifts women, and to ensure that gender apartheid is recognized and confronted in all levels. So today Let us, in
Thanks.
this gathering, to call for action. Let us raise our voice, amplify the struggle of Afghan women, and work together to create a world where every woman and girl has the right to learn, work, and live with dignity and freedom. With that, I would like sincerely thank you all for being here today, for standing in solidarity, and for their commitment for gender equality. I wish you all a successful panel today. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Soshinori. I appreciate that. So, we have our stage all set up for today's discussion. So, as we gather here to talk about gender equity and education, we must confront an undeniable truth, and that's gender apartheid in Afghanistan, which is not just a concept, it's happening. It's a lived reality of millions of Afghan women. Since the Taliban returned to power, Afghan women and girls have faced one of the most extreme forms of gender oppression in the world today, banned from schools and universities, barred from most jobs, and erased from public life. This is not just a women's right crisis, it's an education crisis, an economy crisis, and a humanitarian crisis that demands global attention and action. When education is taken away from women, entire societies suffer. Women's exclusion from education is a tool of control designed to strip them of power and silence their voices. But Afghan women have not been silent. They continue to resist, to advocate, and to push back, often at a great personal risk. To help us dive deeper into this conversation, I'm honored to introduce our keynote speaker, Shabana Nigzat. Shabana is a humanitarian professional with extensive experience in NGOs, international NGOs, and the UN. Currently working with UN Migration, she focuses on emergency response, data management, and advocating for youth exclusion and female empowerment. She's dedicated to amplifying the voices of vulnerable communities and pushing for sustainable solutions. Please join me in welcoming Shabana. The floor is yours, Shabana.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. It's my pleasure to be part of this event, and thank you so much for having me to this critical conversation. As today marked as International Women's Day, I want to extend my warm wishes to all women around the world, and particularly for resilient women in Afghanistan who has resist oppressions with unwavering strength. Thank you so much. In this event, I speak as a voice of millions of women and girls of Afghanistan whose voice have been silenced and stripped their rights and forced into the shadows of oppression. Today, uh, as recognized, Afghanistan is the only country in the world which women and girls systematically removed from the society, where women and girls are facing with extreme gender-based restrictions. The only country where banned education and work for women and girls, where women are denied from their basic human rights. This is not gender discriminations or gender inequality, but this is gender apartheid and oppression. Despite of decades of sacrificing, fighting, and progress, gender apartheid still remains as a very major concern in around the world. In Afghanistan, how gender apartheid have become an evidence and how affect the various aspects of society, including of education. In Afghanistan, women from secondary and university do not have access to learning, and over 2 million girls are with limited access to learning, and also limit alternative platforms for learning, which means lack education, no future female doctors, engineers, leaders, which is deepening Afghanistan into crisis, as well as affected with various aspects of leadership where women are denied for work at NGOs, governments, including UN, which is humanitarian efforts with lack of representation of females at aid distribution. And also, women are forbidden for advocating for their rights, even in private sectors where business are leading for with females and women are facing the force of closure of business. Gender apartheid also affected in public participation of women and girls. Where women and girls in Afghanistan cannot travel alone. They may have should have to go outside with a mahram. Mahram is defining as male relative. It's maybe father, brother, or husband. This is extremely restricting for women for work, healthcare, and also personal freedom. As well as public spaces also closed for women, including gyms, parks, and also beauty salons, which is defining as safe spaces for women. Media and also culture censorships have been silenced, and artists, journalists, activists are not allowed to voice up. Uh, it means and finally, education is not a privilege; it is a human uh, basic rights. And this all restriction is not because of culture or religion. This is because of control and also eraser. Thank you.
Thank you, Shabana, for your powerful insights. Your words serve as a crucial reminder that education is more than just a right. It's a necessity for building sustainable futures, breaking cycles of oppression, and restoring dignity to those who have been systematically excluded. So now we shift to our panel discussion where we will take a deeper look at the intersection of gender apartheid, education, and the urgent need for action. To lead this conversation, I'm honored to introduce our moderator, Julia Sadoff. Julia is a seasoned leader with over 20 years of experience in inclusion, talent analytics, and social impact across academia and beyond. She's an internationally published author on diversity and have received multiple awards for her contributions to organizational development and DEI initiatives. She serves as co-chair and a strategic advisor to UNITAR, Safe York's EDI committee, sites on the board of directors for Ernestine's Women's Shelter, and is also on York University's Alumni Board of Directors. Julia's expertise spans across philosophy, education, law, and ethics, holding a Master's of Education, a law clerk diploma, and certifications in professional ethics, data-driven decision-making, and the ethics of artificial intelligence. So with such a wealth of experience in equity, education, and inclusion, I couldn't think of a better person to guide today's discussion. Julia, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all. Thank you, Huria, Rahim, Education Defenders team, for this empowering event and the in front and behind the scenes work to make this happen. Thank you for the introduction, and you're being very gracious. I actually put up my hand and wanted to be part of this, and Huria considered me as we met at an event. So it is truly my honor. I'm going to open up with a little bit of some of the conversations that we've had, but putting some numbers to it to understand how important this is. Thank you to all the speakers already that have come forth with bravery as well and courage. Angel Guerrera, the Secretary General of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, said, "Women are the most underutilized asset in the world's economy." According to the World Global Tracker, there were 25 significant protests directly related to COVID in 2020, but during that same year, women staged 2,711 protests across 100 countries and territories in relation to violence against women and girls. 25 about a global pandemic that shut down the world, and 2,711 about female violence or oppression during that same year. Think about the magnitude of importance. Mahsa Amini's murder in Iran mobilized a counter-revolution of our time that we've not seen since the French Revolution. It was the first counter-revolution led by women in Iran and inspired sympathy rallies from London to Los Angeles, Sydney to Seoul, Tokyo to Tunis sympathy rallies. Countries with powerful feminist movements, stronger democracies, or higher women's representation in parliament than countries without have 5 times more gender-sensitive measures. This is the power of access, governance, and education for women, for women. Education is a powerful tool for dismantling gender apartheid by empowering women, promoting equity and access, challenging gender role norms, strengthening policy and governance advocacy, promoting global and technical skills for development, establishing financial independence, and strengthening international advocacy and pressure. It plays a critical role in breaking down institutionalized gender segregation and discrimination. And with this, I, as moderator, have the honor of introducing our incredible, esteemed panel that are breaking down and doing this work with these barriers. I'm going to take the short bios so we can get to the panel and actually hearing from them, because I'm not really the main character in this event at all. So first, Dr. Laura Golesorski, I always want to say everybody's name correctly, is a professor of political science and global affairs at the University of Portland. These are the shorter bios. The longers will be put in to the chat, so you really get to see the richness and scope of work. As the founder of the Center for Migration, Gender, and Justice, she combines her scholarly expertise with the lived experience to address gender-based persecution, particularly concerning women and girls in Afghanistan and Iran. Dr. Funmi Adiani is a human rights advocate and lawyer with a PhD in law, specializing in human rights protection. With over a decade of experience across Africa, she focuses on climate justice, social inclusion, empowering marginalized communities, especially women and girls, to influence policy and drive sustainable change. Tanuja Gahana, did I say that right? Almost. I'm seeing your face.
Taranayagam.
Taranagam. There we go. Thank you. Is a Sri Lankan-born anti-racism practitioner with over 20 years in human resources, specializing in equity, diversity, and inclusion. She holds an MBA and an MED currently pursuing a PhD focused on immigrant women of color in Canada. Tanuja is also a mental health advocate and board member of the GenWell Project. And lastly, but just as impressive is Ziana Kotida, is a Canadian anti-violence advocate and strategic communications specialist with a master's in philosophy and multidisciplinary gender studies from the University of Cambridge. Recognized as one of Alberta's 2024 top 30 under 30, Ziana actively serves on multiple boards and advises Senator Marilu McFedrin. Welcome, incredible panelists, and thank you for making the time to inspire and empower. There are 3 tenets education defenders outlined for this session that help us tap into experiences and expertise: learn, act, and call to action. Let's start with learn, understanding the issue. So I'm going to go with this particular question. We discussed it, and we're actually going to tap on each one of our panelists, and then we'll go through some questions and really focusing on the specialist and SMEs in each one of those questions, and I'll call on them. So let's start with, tell us more about your work in gender equity and women's empowerment. And I'll start with Dr. Lara, and then Dr. Funmi, Ziana, and then Tanuja, if that's okay. So Dr. Lara, thank you.
Many thanks to the organizers, the Education Defenders Network, Afghan Gender and Women's Studies Group, the Canada Knowledge Center for having me, to Shabana for the powerful keynote, and to Julia for introducing me. As mentioned, I describe myself as a scholar practitioner, meaning that my academic work as a professor informs my policy practice and advocacy as the founder and executive director at the Center for Migration, Gender, and Justice. But what really towers all of this is my identity as a German Iranian migrant woman. My lived experiences are what drives my work in gender equity and women's empowerment. And in short, my work is concerned with the intersection of migration and gender. And I focus on human rights, laws, and institutions in locally based and globally engaged context. And this includes my new project on gender apartheid and asylum, to which I will speak more later in this session. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Dr. Funmi, may I ask you?
Thank you very much, and all protocols duly observed. Thank you once more to the organizers of this event, a beautiful event. Thank you to our keynote speakers, and Julia, thank you very much for introducing me. I think I'm going to also try to keep it short, as Lara has done. Very great example. I usually like to describe myself as a people-based practitioner more often than not, people say, but you're a lawyer, why don't you identify as just a lawyer? And I say that's because the work I do is beyond just law or beyond human rights. It's actually recentering the conversation around development to people. And my particular focus over the last 16, 17 years working across the African continent has been on women, girls, and also people. Similar to Lara, I straddle different identities as a woman of color, as a person who lives with an invisible disability, and as someone who has faced social exclusion in different perspectives. And so being able to bring that into my work on policy advisory and on advocacy, taking it from working with grassroots communities on trying to influence policy across different states and thinking of moving from local to national to regional, but also saying how is what we're doing on the continent, because so much, and as you would see in some of my responses later, which mainly embody an African perspective, so much of what we're doing gets lost in translation and could actually help to influence movements across the global majority. I hate to say the global south. I prefer to say the global majority. And so how do we take those practices and those learnings and scale them to international advocacy? That also forms part of what I'm doing across different contexts, but particularly in a human and gender rights perspective. Thank you.
Oh, I could just keep writing about all of this. This is absolutely wonderful, and we've only started. Next, Ziana.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much to all of the organizers for having me. I'm so grateful and feeling really lucky to be speaking alongside such incredible women today. My name is Ziana Kotadia. I was born and raised in Calgary, Canada, in a community of twice displaced people who've moved from South Asia to East Africa to North America. So I live and work in a Canadian context, and I wear a few different hats when it comes to gender justice. I am an advocate, I'm a storyteller and a researcher, and I kind of orient my work in terms of the future that I'm hoping to build towards. And for me, that is a feminist and anti-racist future that really centers creativity and love and collaboration. As you heard from my bio, I'm relatively early career. I just wrapped up my MPhil in gender studies. And my research is oriented around understanding the systems of power and the operations of power that enable institutionalized violence, and then trying to understand how this violence is then replicated and reproduced in our relationships and our intimate spheres. So this is a lot of the work that I do now, is thinking about those intimate spheres and working to kind of prevent domestic violence and gender-based violence from happening. So I lead gender justice communications at a research hub where the focus is on that prevention of violence and taking research findings and turning them into action. So whether that's through policy change or legislative reform, or making sure the right people have access to the information they need to prevent and address gender-based violence. I would say at the end of the day, my work is really about two things. And the first is dismantling and understanding those systems of power that allow inequality and violence to persist. And the second is making sure that those folks and those people and those communities most affected by that violence are really centered in conversations and decisions that are shaping their lives. And whether it is through research or policy or storytelling, I think gender justice isn't just something we talk about or something that we do. It's really something we shape in community together. So very grateful to be in community with you all today.
Thank you so much, Sienna. I don't know if anybody heard, but included in that future with all the lists that Sienna was hoping, it included love. That was pretty powerful. So Tanusha next.
Thank you so much. I'm going to echo what everybody said, Dr. Laura, Dr. Funmi, and Ziana. Thank you for having me, and it's such a powerful house to be here. So my work, and my work, predominantly my work centers around the Canadian context as well. So my work and research kind of centers around immigrant women of color and the intersectionality of gender and race, and particularly focus on the connection of economic theory and how these theories may or may not work towards certain bodies, particularly of immigrant women of color. And their focus is on investigating the challenges faced by these women in navigating very complex job market in Canada, particularly looking at underemployment, unemployment of these constituents as well. I also further investigate and look into once you are hired, and I think Julia used this term, institutional segregation, and the issues of psychological safety, issues of cultural assimilation, and the mentorship and sponsorship, and who owns that, and this whole system of meritocracy. How does that show up for certain bodies? So, and overall, I look at how these neoliberal policies sort of segregate immigrant, particularly of immigrant women of color from, I also don't like to use the term global South. Who decides those terms? IMF, World Bank, who holds those? So I deliberately don't use that term. I also deliberately don't use the term marginalized. Marginalized sounds like a victim. I use equity deserving because that says that the society has a responsibility towards these women. So, yeah. So and I also took down this term when Julia said underutilized. This immigrant women, I have been part of several immigrant women groups. And one of the things that sort of comes out as a huge theme is this underutilization of skills. And it's also the other side of education. Like these are all very educated doctors, engineers, accountants, like just name it. This is the reason why they are here. And now this segregation of this happens even after being here. So that's sort of my background looking into it's actually my lived experience that I turned it into I'm not born here. I'm not raised here. I came in my mid-20s, and this is my story that I turned it into a research, and I can't wait to have more conversations about that. Thank you.
It's a good thing that I'm off on mute because I'm like, yes, yes, yes. I keep saying that. As a D&I practitioner, I'm so inspired because there's always so much to learn. You don't have the lived experiences of every person. And there's some really rich intersectionalities of our panelists that I can't wait to talk more about. So thank you all for really delving in and showing us what that work is and the passion behind the work based on lived experiences as well, right? That is a richness that cannot be replaced by not having that lived experience as well. So within the tenet of learn still, understanding the issue, the next question that I'd like to pose to Dr. Funmi, if that's okay, is how does gender apartheid manifest in restrictions on education, leadership, and public participation?
Thank you very much, Julia. I also was going, yes, yes. So I think it's great that the panel is in sync and that we're thinking alike, and that makes my work easier. I think I just need to start by reiterating that gender apartheid is not just a metaphor. It's actually the lived experience and reality for women and for girls all around the world, but particularly in where the global majority lives. And just as Shabnam has said, education is not just a right, it's an equalizer. Is the one thing we have to break systems of oppression, of poverty, and of inequality. Yet, gendered barriers at different levels continue to persist to deny women access. Within an African context, and very unlike the experiences that have been shared by my Afghan sisters, African gender apartheid is often very informal, it's not codified. And so you see it expressed in economic, in cultural, and in conflict-driven situations, as against it being legally codified. For instance, in Malawi, you see through the denial of access to resources, girls' school dropout rate spikes at about when they begin puberty, simply because they do not have access to menstruation care products. And then that comes along with stigma, lack of sanitation in schools. But let me just quickly go on to speak about the three things. Number one, on restrictions in education. How does that manifest in this context? First is the issue of early marriage and pregnancy exclusions. Unfortunately, there are still too many countries around Africa that are pro-child marriage. And I know this is also the case for many of the places where the global majority lives. An added layer to this is that we have very weak legal and enforcement systems which protect women and girls. And when you find countries like Tanzania or Sierra Leone, school policies historically bar pregnant girls from continuing their education. What this then means is that we have a higher number of girls, particularly when they get to high school age, who drop out of schooling, reinforcing the idea that a girl's worth is tied to motherhood as against her intellectual growth. Secondly, is violence and safety concerns on restriction in education. School-related gender-based violence remains a pressing issue. I live in South Africa, and every other day on the news, there is one headline or the other regarding school-related gender-based violence, starting from children in ECDs being raped up until young ladies in tertiary education being sexually harassed. Thirdly is the discriminatory social norms, which we're seeing playing out beyond that. You will remember in the northern parts of Nigeria in 2014, there was the big outcry around the Chibok schoolgirls who were abducted in school. And since then, this disenfranchisement has continued, such that in most of northeast Nigeria right now, you have many, many girls out of school because the minute girls are enrolled in schools, they are kidnapped, they are raped, they are harassed to make sure they are not allowed in school. But this translates beyond education for the now. It translates into barriers to leadership. First is the underrepresentation in politics. Across Africa generally, women hold less than 25% parliamentary seats. Now, it gets worse when you disaggregate that across regions and across countries. But this moves into something else that is very hardly talked about, the glass cliff within leadership. We've seen a few women who have gone through breaking the barriers against education, breaking the barriers against underrepresentation in politics, and then moving on to being in leadership. But they get into leadership and they find that there's a glass cliff there where there are more structural constraints, they are undermined in terms of how they can carry on their power. And I'd like to use a very recent example that played out just this week, actually. It's a case regarding a Nigerian senator. I must first of all say that Nigeria has the lowest representation across the whole of Africa of women in parliament, only 3.67%. Within the Senate, there are only 4 women out of 109 member senates. At the House of Representatives, you have only 16 women out of 360 members House of Representatives. Now, when you have that already low numbers, you think that the Senate and the structures will try to encourage women in power, but the exact opposite is what's happening. We found last week that one of the female senators was summarily suspended for 6 months because she chose to speak truth to power. She stood up and confronted her alleged abuser, the Senate president, by filing a formal complaint. And in a retaliatory move, the Senate Ethics Committee, in clear disregard of multiple Supreme Court rulings, which affirm that the Senate lacks the constitutional authority to suspend its members, decided to go ahead to suspend her. Not only did they do that, to compound this injustice, they publicly noted that her security detail has been withdrawn, thereby exposing her to further harm. This is the reality of women in power. Finally, on restrictions in public life and economic participation, we find that across Africa, there is still a huge difference in women's access to land and economic resources. Women do not own land culturally in many parts of Africa. And when you ask why, it's tailed back to traditions and customs. The one thing I like to say when I enter into context is that customs are living, they are not static, and they evolve with people. We cannot blame customs in 2025 for women's lack of access to land and other productive resources. Also, is workplace discrimination, which is still a reality for so many women across the continent. First is the gendered pay gap, which is a huge issue here. And then women continue to face barriers to entry across different fields, but particularly in STEM-related fields. And when all of this compounds together, you find that it's a system which continues to bar women from entering into education, entering into politics, but also entering into being able to fully participate in public life and to be fully empowered to do so. Thank you.
I like that you were like, and thank you, because that is leaving us with so much to think about. Thank you for also bringing the numbers of representation and the experiences of when women do even make it into those positions of decision making, how there is those barriers that we've seen, and to build on actually what's the impact of these barriers on women's empowerment, which is the next question. I'm going to pose it to Dr. Lara. I do want to read the question and even add something, which is, what is the impact of these barriers on women's empowerment, economic security, and global development? And Dr. Lara, when we were talking about these questions, included displacement, which is something else that we have to look at. So, Dr. Lara?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. Although I'm happy to speak on the other parts as well. I feel myself best suited to talk about the displacement component here.
Please.
And I want to reiterate here again, like what do we mean, or how is gender apartheid defined in this current moment? And I really appreciated bringing up that although currently kind of the definition that has been established understands gender apartheid as the systematic and institutionalized exclusion of persons from all areas of life based on their gender, we have to, of course, recognize that institutionalization, as was mentioned by my dear colleague, sometimes it manifests in different ways, right? And so that we need to understand gender apartheid and this definition. To me, the focus is really on the systematic exclusion. How do we see the systematic exclusion taking place based on gender identity, but also something that I wanted to bring up here is sexual orientation and sexuality, to not have this definition being solely focused on a gender binary. But again, maybe that's something we can take into the Q&A later. I'll speak on how gender apartheid has led to significant displacement for now. And I'll also provide some numbers with regards to this. So it is estimated that as of 2024, globally, nearly 10.9 million Afghans remain displaced, mostly within the country or in neighboring countries. And indeed, Iran, which is also considered a gender apartheid state, has become the primary destination for displaced Afghans. As of mid-2024, Iran was actually the world's #1 refugee receiving country, with 3.8 million people, of whom 99% were from Afghanistan. Yet at the same time, people are fleeing Iran as well, especially women and girls, due to restrictive policies on their bodily autonomy. So here we have a situation of what I refer to as the gender apartheid displacement continuum, meaning that women and girls are fleeing from one gender apartheid state to another. And so this really demands urgent action as the 1951 Refugee Convention, the fundamental international law on asylum, demands urgent action, and that convention does not include gender-based persecution as a standalone ground for protection. And so this is something that we need to consider, and this is what I look into with my work. A promising development in this regard has come from Europe with a recent decision by the European Court of Justice, holding that gender and nationality alone are sufficient to grant asylum to Afghan women and girls, given the deliberately and systematically, and these are the words that the court used, right? So again, we see the importance of how do we define gender apartheid. Again, given the quote, deliberately and systematically applied measures that deny Afghan women fundamental rights related to human dignity on account of their gender. And I'll speak more to this in a moment, but I'll leave it here for now.
Thank you so much. I know I've heard it a few times, but it is, from your words, Dr. Lara, demands urgent action. And so that is going to be what we jump off into, even though we are never ending our learning and in that tenet, but jumping into the second tenet, just for time, we want to make sure is act. What can be done? And so the next question to the wonderful Tanuja is, what collective actions can we take to support gender equity?
Beautiful. I just took down, Laura, your point about gender apartheid continuum. Oh my God, what a powerful language to have, right? So in order for us to act, there's three different things that we can do. And individually, let me start with that a macro level, what we can do as individuals, right? So educate ourselves. This particular what the issues faced by. I mean, my focus is predominantly on women, and I agree with Laura. Gender is not a binary, so it's kind of so educate ourselves and challenge our barriers. Let's face it, all of us are very biased human beings. As human beings, we all carry a level of biases and know what those biases are and continue to challenge those things, right? And we all have a level of privilege that we carry in one way or the other. And recognize that and become a mentor or a sponsor and advocate for fairness. And that's at an individual level. If we see fairness, I'm going to give you a Canadian stat here. Every dollar a Canadian born man makes, an educated immigrant woman makes 29.5% less. So that is about almost every dollar every dollar a man makes, a Canadian born man makes, educated immigrant woman makes 70 cents. Do the math, right? And that's what the economic segregation looks like. That's what the economic apartheid looked like, right? So at a workplace, all of us are working. We all have the ability to make a change as well. I mean, one of the things that I always advocate for is equitable hiring practices. North American context, we have this ability to hire through our network. So at the end of the day, we all look the same. And I'm not talking about us. I'm talking about, you know what I'm referring to. Our leadership. Look at our leadership. Representation matters. And we need to have those voices there. So, and also looking at policies for creating safe and equitable and inclusive workplace for particularly women of color. And this is such an important aspect. Every person that I spoke to, that they had, they didn't fail safe in the workplace. And finally, I want to look at the societal or at a macro level and at a governmental level as well. And this is something that I humbly request. If you have boys, sons, like, or anybody, engage them in this conversation. It's such an important, this is where the change starts. And I think this is not a very popular concept in the world of aid, equity, diversity, and inclusion practitioners. You need to involve white men in this conversation. You need to include them and you need to bring them into this space. I call it call in approach as opposed to call out, because they doesn't matter. They have the power and privilege to be able to create a voice for women, right? And also kind of looking at gender diversity and advocacy for supportive law towards that. And so one of the recommendations coming from my research is that we need to look at alternate frameworks for policy decisions, looking at an intersectional approach, not just a way looking at an economic lens, but looking at an intersectional lens, maybe a critical race lens, maybe a looking at an anti-racist lens. I don't know, but what does that look like for us in reality? So all these things that we cannot look at it in order for us to act, we cannot just look at just one or the other. We need to look at different aspects at macro, micro, and at meso level changes, and particularly looking at a policy change in terms of that at a governmental and societal level.
So fantastic. I wrote something down. Maybe people know it already, but I want to bring it into the fold, which is the word Tanuja used and talking about economic apartheid. When we think about apartheid, we think about it sometimes being in the North, right? Or Canada or the US it's the idea of othering, right? So these things are happening so intensely in another place, in another world, despite our experiences as immigrants and women of color and all of our intersections that you cannot see. And economic apartheid is something that is happening currently. It's a way to find yourself in that. Many experiences, but that is fantastic, is to introduce us to what we are experiencing as well. And then the privilege that we have, which is a responsibility we have to use. So that's, that is where we're going to next, actually, which is our call to action, which you led us into. So thank you so much. Sorry, before we go to call to action, is a little bit more testimonials and success stories from some of the deep work that's happening within the tenet of ACT and what can be done. So I'm going to move to Ziana to be able to share that. And then we're going to move to Dr. Laura, who's also going to bring in a little bit of international law in that flavor as well. So Ziana, may I ask you if you'd like to share a personal story, testimonial, or success story?
Yes, absolutely. So this is a story that I think has helped inform the way I come to my work, but also in a lot of ways has shaped my understanding of what it means to resist to violence that an institution has normalized and facilitated. So I used to be the chair of the Safe Campus Coalition, which is a non-for-profit focused on education and advocacy to prevent and address gender-based violence on Canadian post-secondary campuses specifically. And the origin story of that organization was certainly a formative experience in terms of thinking about what resistance can look like, how people can come together in community. Julie, I think you talked about it in your introduction, but to leverage the power of protest, of pressure in breaking down institutionalized gender inequality. So I attended Western University during my undergrad. And in September 2021, when students were kind of returning to campus for the first time following a long stretch of online learning in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, this really devastating wave of sexual violence hit just as students were navigating that orientation and coming back to classes in ways that was incredibly not only disruptive, but really shined a spotlight on the sort of cultures and structures that enable that kind of sexual violence to happen to so many young students on post-secondary campuses. These stories of what had happened first began to spread as whispers on TikTok, and then, very quickly became a roar. And while the institutional response was certainly inadequate, the students had an entirely different response and an entirely different way of understanding the importance of coming to that moment and coming to that moment together. At the time, I was the vice president of the student union for the university, and behind the scenes was coordinating with orientation leaders and emergency services to respond to the crisis, supporting survivors. And I remember very vividly organizing with other students to kind of try and build a moment for us to come together. We were, looking for microphones and equipment for what we hoped would be a gathering of maybe 500 students, maybe 1,000 students. And instead, 10,000 survivors and allies flooded into the heart of our campus. And everyone was dressed in teal, the color of sexual assault awareness, and formed what actually looked like a tidal wave, a blue tidal wave of students and allies and community members who were coming together to resist, to stand in solidarity with one another. And no one that I've spoken to has a living memory of that sort of gathering of students and community members at Western University, and no one's seen one since. In that moment, we saw high-profile Canadian political leaders like Justin Trudeau sharing their support and speaking to the importance of addressing violence on Canadian post-secondary campuses. But what I think the organizers of that event found really interesting is that it took an extraordinary level of harm and a national spotlight before any leader took stock of what that kind of violence can do to a person and the kind of institutionalized exclusion that is enforced when women, when people with femme bodies know that coming to campus spaces is going to produce that kind of effect. And that sort of understanding of what it kind of takes to demonstrate the importance of doing this work meant that the organizers saw an opportunity to move beyond just that one moment, but to actually form the Safe Campus Coalition, that non-for-profit, and really commit in a long-term way to confronting and dismantling the culture and the processes that make gender-based violence so pervasive on post-secondary campuses. Because at the end of the day, and the reality is that this violence is not random. It's not an anomaly. It's a very predictable outcome of systems that enable and normalize harm. And so when I think about, the moment that we're in spaces across the world, and how easy it is to kind of lean into a hopelessness about how much work has to happen, and how deeply entrenched these cultures of violence are, I think about that moment. I think about how many people were able to stand together in what, for me, kind of felt like a microcosm of, bigger and, more deeply entrenched challenges playing out in different ways across the world. And for me is a really powerful example of not only how we can alter and reshape what can often feel like a very particular directionality of power, where what institutions designate as real is what we have to accept, but also to really leverage that and galvanize it for meaningful change.
It's very powerful. It leaves us disrupted, sad and happy and disconcerted and deconstructed. And I think that's an important place for us to really recognize what's happening out there and how real it is. I mean, with Ernestine's Women's Shelter, I hear it as well, but never numb to it, so that we continue moving forward in advocacy is very important. Thank you for that. Dr. Lara?
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much again for this powerful testimony to what realities look like with regards to this. I will speak more in terms of kind of the legal framework that I see currently existing and where we might go from here, which might be a nice transition to kind of the action and where to go next. So as mentioned in my brief introduction, the project that I'm currently working on is on gender apartheid and asylum, with a focus on actually establishing general risks of gender-based persecution in international refugee law, because there's currently an absence of this, right? Currently, gender-based persecution does not constitute a standalone protected ground in international refugee law. And while some states have included persecution on the basis of gender in their refugee definition, there does not exist a comprehensive protection framework on this matter at the global level. And this needs to change. And that's pretty much what inspired and motivated my research on this and what I argue. And the situations of women and girls in Afghanistan, primarily, also in Iran and other manifestations of gender apartheid, offer not only the urgency with regards to this, but also the evidence for this. So something needs to happen. We see what's going on. And so here are three promising trends in this regard. And I'm careful with my language. I'm saying promising. I can't quite say they're success stories quite yet. But in my opinion, as a scholar, I see them as promising trends that I would like to briefly outline. So the first one actually comes from the field of international refugee law and is the noted court decision I mentioned earlier by the European Court of Justice, holding that gender and nationality alone are sufficient to grant asylum to Afghan women and girls. And it's important to note here that this decision is binding on EU member states in which a similar case arises. So it has this comprehensive component to it, at least at the EU level. However, while the court clarifies considerations around gender-based persecution in international refugee law, it does not explicitly reference the term gender apartheid, albeit reflecting what has been defined as such. And I included some language on this earlier, right? The deliberate application of certain measures that deny certain freedoms. But it's not explicitly mentioned, the term. Other developments in international refugee law actually more explicitly reference gender apartheid. For instance, the country guidance on Afghanistan by the EU Asylum Agency, which established general risks of gender-based persecution for Afghan women and girls in 2023. The guidance, as the name says, however, is not binding. It rather presents a framework for EU member states to take into account when they're determining refugee status. And the same goes for a statement by the UN Refugee Agency on the concept of persecution on commutative grounds in light of the current situation, again, for women and girls in Afghanistan. So that's international refugee law, where I see promising trends. The other two promising trends that I would like to briefly sketch out come from different areas of international law, namely international criminal law and international human rights law. In terms of international criminal law, the ongoing process for a new crimes against humanity treaty is of note because it categorizes gender-based persecution as a standalone crime against humanity. And it actually aims to codify gender apartheid in international law provisions. And this is really significant. The treaty will now move into formal negotiations with an expected conclusion in 2029. So there's a lot of advocacy right now happening around this, that the codification of gender apartheid actually happens and that there's a categorization of gender-based persecution as a standalone crime. Other developments in international criminal law that can be briefly mentioned here are the potential investigation of the situation in Afghanistan for gender persecution crimes by the International Criminal Court and a potential case in front of the International Court of Justice for gender discrimination under the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, or CEDAW. And so this then brings me to the third promising trend that I see, which is in international human rights law. Namely the issuance of a general recommendation by the CEDAW Committee on the equal and inclusive representation of women in decision-making systems. And the recommendation holds provisions on gender apartheid, calling for its codification in order to create full accountability for gender-based crimes, and it actually defines gender apartheid in explicit ways. So to me, these three developments are certainly to be watched, and I will continue to write and advocate around them. And I see my writing as a tool of advocacy as well. So again, if this is of interest to you, please connect with me, and I'm happy to speak on these three promising trends more also in the Q&A, if that's of interest. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. I think it's really important that we do balance, when we're talking about this, how the depth of the work and how heavy it is, because it's real and it's lived experiences that are currently, that there is still, like the word promising, right? Are there areas that we do see that we're moving a little bit towards hope? And we know how powerful hope is in the work that we do. I think it's really timely that we're going to move to, once again, learn and act can continuously be pulled out and discussed. And so I don't want to ever stop that. Please, by all means, think about your questions when we have Q&A, but to move on so that our panelists really get to cover kind of our share and call to action. So moving forward, the question is, how can individuals, organizations, and policymakers take action to ensure education is prioritized in the fight against gender apartheid? And we're going to hear from Dr. Funmi first and then Ziana next. So Dr. Funmi. I'm not sure if Dr. Funmi, are you? Maybe there was some issues with internet. Do you see her on?
I was just checking. I
Yeah.
can't see her.
I can't. Okay, so what we'll
Yeah,
do,
we
we'll
can
give it
move to
time
next.
and I'll check back. And maybe Sienna, if you're okay with that.
Yeah, absolutely. So the question about what we can do to take action to ensure education is prioritized. Tanuja, I actually want to pick up on something that you were talking about in your remarks, because when I hear that question, I think about those different levels at which we need to make change, the macro, the micro, the meso levels of change, and how we can kind of think about multiple spheres. And I want to hone in on the interpersonal sphere, because we have to change systems, but we also have to change people. And we also have to be in community with each other to make that kind of change. So in my context, in Alberta, in Canada, we have a government that, on the whole, is not especially interested in informed decision making. And that has meant that in the anti-violence sector, the tactics that our communities are taking up to try and enact change have shifted to become a little bit more localized and community oriented and less focused on legislative change as the only way that we can make change. It's one of many different tools that we have access to. But one really powerful way of shifting the way that our systems and our social networks operate is by doing that calling in work. We talked very briefly, I think, about the importance of engaging men and engaging boys as partners in this work of unraveling the systems and the cultures that produce gendered violence, that produce gendered apartheid. And when I think about education, we talk about education systems, but education can also mean conversations at the dinner table. It can mean conversations in your sphere of influence, in the communities that you have access to. And I think in this moment, and I know so many of us here today will be feeling it, it feels like our global world order is navigating tectonic and unprecedented change in ways that are overwhelming to think about in their entirety. And I think in this particular moment, we really need to stay connected. We really need each other. We really need those conversations at the dinner table that help us to bridge the gaps of isolation and polarization that are making it so challenging and so difficult to understand each other in this moment. And so one of my favorite feminist scholars, Sarah Ahmed, she says in her book, Living a Feminist Life, that she uses the word feminism, but I think you could substitute that for gender equity work, for gender justice, whatever, makes sense in the context you're operating in, but how feminism is homework. And she means that in more than one sense. It's the work you bring home with you, but it's also the work you do on your home. It is those kitchen table conversations. It is those moments in community, in your spheres of influence, the education you're doing through conversation in an everyday kind of way. Those are the moments where we really assemble ourselves through ordinary conversation. And I just wanted to emphasize the power and the importance of that form of education as we all do the work of gender justice in a context that otherwise, if we don't, I think, ground ourselves in those moments of interpersonal and community connection, can become exceptionally overwhelming. Thank you.
I think we are seeing this psychological fatigue, this exhaustion when we're looking at, civil and political shifts, right? That you're saying that are tectonic, like what a great word. And then taking that and realizing how heavy that is. But that doesn't stop us from knowing that we have homework, which is really important statement. So thank you. Was Dr. Funmi able to return?
Yes, yes,
Oh,
she's
yes.
there.
Thank you. So, Dr. Funmi, I'm just going to say the question that we were discussing, and we were waiting for you on this one. So I'm so happy we just heard from Sienna, which was amazing. How can individuals, organizations, and policymakers take action to ensure education is prioritized in the fight against gender apartheid?
Thank you very much. And apologies, I dropped off the call and I've been struggling to log back in on my computer, but it kicks me out. So I'm joining back on my phone just to make sure I conclude this. Thank you very much for all the insights that have been shared so far. I think going back again, it's important that we continue to reiterate, and particularly when we're thinking of how individuals, organizations, policymakers can take action, that education remains a tool, a very powerful one to dismantling gender apartheid. However, I want to come in with quite a different point of view. Many times when we think about education, we think about education from a very colonialist perspective, and we think about education in a particular one form of knowing, one form, formal education, basically. And while I think that we must continue to push for formal education, I think that is also very important for us, particularly for those who live in areas where the global majority of the world lives. We must embrace a decolonial approach, one that recognizes multiple ways of knowing and of being as a legitimate form of education also. And this means shifting away from very Eurocentric models of learning that have historically excluded women, excluded indigenous knowledge systems, excluded our oral traditions and community-driven ways of learning. I think that it's very important because all these alternate education models center African epistemologies and reclaim the positionality of women in education. And I think that's very important when we're talking about dismantling gender apartheid from an education perspective. For instance, I look at the work that the Rwandan Women's Network is doing, and amongst one of its many tools in terms of using education as a way to address gender apartheid is that it uses traditional storytelling circles to educate women on reproductive health, on gender and sexuality rights, on political participation of women, thereby bridging the gap between contemporary social issues, but also indigenous knowledge. Also, I think we need to understand that these forms of knowing and these ways of education challenge rigid structures of formal schooling by recognizing that there is a place for community-based learning. And we spoke earlier about coming together in community, and even the example that was given shows the place of community in actually driving the kind of change that we want. I come back to the Grandmother Project in Senegal, which works through elder women in the community to help pass down indigenous wisdom in health practices, life skills to younger women outside of formal schools. Across Africa, women have always historically been known to be knowledge keepers. Now, with the coming of colonialism, that got turned on its head. And we find ourselves at a point right now where the highest number of out of school learners are women across the continent, women and girls. Now, if we're going to change that tide around, then we must, together with the drive and the push for formal education systems, embrace other ways of knowing and of being.
I think another example that I'll just like to give would also be in Zimbabwe and Mozambique, the Ngana Omwari Initiation Schools, which provide young girls with life skills training. It provides them with financial literacy, reproductive health or education, which is very key in our context, but also helps them to navigate several issues around financial literacy, ownership of assets, of resources on the ground. And so when I think of what could be done beyond the everyday typical solutions, I think we need to localize our solutions for our context. And for my particular context, localizing that solution means going back to ask what worked before the big disruption of colonization. Why are we not adopting those same systems that work, albeit in new forms, as we're seeing through the different organizations who are now adopting this decolonialist movement towards education, and then to go ahead to implement them in a localized context and in a context that people are able to tap into and to work with. Thank you.
I like the idea that sometimes when we think about solutions to things or call to actions, that it may seem like it's a really big hill. And you've given ways in which we can think about it as digestible and localized, as you say, and communal in building that and breaking down the barriers of a colonized idea. So thank you so much. I want to be mindful of time and the opportunity for a few questions to come in before we wrap up. There's just so much here, but please take this opportunity to ask a few questions if you want to put it in the chat, or if you'd like to be able to maybe perhaps hand up if I can see, or say it. By all means, it's a very intimate setting. Please share any kind of thoughts or any questions to this wonderful panel, and including our speakers as well. Give it a moment.
Yeah, we have one question. Meredith.
I don't see.
Yeah, please go
Hello,
ahead.
and thank you for this wonderful presentation. I really appreciated that one of the speakers said that feminism is a homework that we should bring home. And I've really enjoyed the sessions. So my question is, how can a woman work on her personal development to foster cultural synergy in a community where men are most privileged?
Does any one of our panelists want to take that? Or keynotes?
I can take that. If Meredith, can you repeat that question for me? Meredith? Yeah.
How
Can you repeat that question? Yeah. Yeah, go
Yes,
ahead.
how can a woman work on her personal development, foster cultural synergy in a community where men are the most privileged?
That's a really great question. I think that I'm going to answer a little bit differently here, right? So this is what I talked about a little bit. Ziana touched on this as well, this idea of calling in. I mean, I think traditionally we had this approach where leaving them out of these conversations. And this is why it's so important to kind of bring them into this conversation and start talking about why this is such an important journey and continue to educate women, and particularly in this context. I think this is what I would do. This might not be a popular, but it's just that calling them into your world. And I think this is why Julia and I had talked about it in a couple of few days ago about how the importance of educating our sons, and in the importance of educating our sons around these issues of gender equality. Because I also want to point out that we can get to the point of equality until we talk about equity. Equity is about access. It's about, so I think I don't know if I answered your question, Meredith. I think it's very important that we need to bring them into this conversation. It's that calling in. We are so used to calling out people, and we have failed to kind of we. This is how this right wing had taken um, a stab at this work because we have always been excluded them from this conversation. It's important that we bring them in. And I always ask this question, what do you mean by woke? There's a lot of conversations around wokeness. The opposite of wokeness is asleep. That's not an option that's available to us, or no anybody for that matter as a society.
Wonderful. Ziana, I know you wanted to add a little bit to that as well. Is that wonderful, Tanuja's response?
Yeah, absolutely. And very briefly, thinking about your question and thinking about it in an interpersonal context, something I find really helpful when having these conversations with men and boys in my world and in my community is thinking about the entry points into understanding what gender privilege, looks like. From a standpoint that makes sense to them. So, thinking about my cultural context in Canada, where often the lighter your skin is, the more access to institutionalized privileges you have, and the less you have to prove that you deserve to be here. When talking to men in my community, that's very easily something that they can understand as brown-skinned men. And that is often that intersection, that way of moving through the world that I share with them. If that's something that they can understand in a way I understand it, I can start from there and then say, if that makes sense to you, imagine how that gender difference might look and how that might manifest, because they do have, that embodied understanding of a kind of difference that makes it so that they, navigate systemic oppression in a lot of ways. So finding those entry points into conversation, those bridge building moments, is something that I find helpful in my own spaces.
Beautifully said. With my sons, my husband is European Jewish background. And so we have sons that are sons of color. And one of my sons is fluid. And so for him to understand, even though he doesn't understand my own experiences, he does understand the struggle. And with that are those entry points of understanding how we stand up for each other and how we have advocacy, because there's a intrinsic understanding of struggle and tapping into that. I saw somebody else's hand up, I believe.
It was me. I
Yes,
just wanted to add on.
please.
Thank you very much. And thank you to the last two speakers. I think I just want to add on to what Tanu just said. I think the phrase of calling men in is critical, and I 100% am on board. I also think the when around calling men in, and this leads to the conversation we had the other day. I don't think we should wait till they're men. I think we should begin to call men in as boys. And I think that's the critical point of intervention when minds are being shaped, when worldviews are informed, is a point of intervention. And I go back to one of my favorite authors, We Should All Be Feminists, reading and her thinking. And I think that is the point where we should begin to leverage and say feminism and feminist actions and feminist call isn't just for women. It's actually for everyone, boys inclusive. And that is the point where we should begin to call future men in.
That's very powerful. Thank you. I know it's 11:28, Furia. Should I do a quick recap before we
I see two other hands. I guess Julia,
let's
we can take just
I would
two more
rather take the
questions.
hands too, if that's okay. And
Yes,
yeah,
please. Yeah,
sure.
yeah.
I cannot see all the hands unless I go through. Do you see?
Yar Mohammed is there online.
Okay, let's
Yeah.
start. Thank you. Thank you for participating all.
Right?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and happy International Women's Day. Okay, a man's voice is for the first time. Well, I have a question for the scholars. I'm actually a quantitative scholar for development and water resources management, so I'm the number guy. What I see is a disconnect between scholarship, between political organizations, and between advocacy. I'm here participating from Afghanistan. Will support. In fact, 15 of our party members are celebrating this day with you together, including 4 women. And I see how we can connect, how can we bring the equality, the issues of gender equality and gender equity without a political institution, without a civil society institution. And when I was at the university, I noticed on many occasions that there is disconnect between scholarship, between advocacy, and between political organization. In many parts, they actually contradict and challenge each other instead of going together to reach the goal of the women and the equality of the society. So if you can elaborate on that, that would be good.
Thank you, Yara. It's important to hear male voices and advocacy of this space and seeing it. So thank you for showing up and sharing that as well. We're at 11:30 time. This was wonderful. It was recorded, so I know that I will respectfully hand it over to Huria rather than going through a highlighted level of the richness of this conversation that I know we can continue to do. But I wanted to thank you for me being able to come into this space and even being a witness and bearing witness to the great work of, I say, my colleagues, but I'm standing on the shoulders of giants doing this work. So thank you. And over to you, Huria. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Julia. I guess if any of our speakers and panelists would like to address the question that Dr. Yar raised about how to connect the politics, advocacy, and academia when it comes to gender equity. Okay, Dr. Lara, please, floor is yours.
Yes, thank you so much for bringing up this point because it's something that I struggle with. I see with all the time these tensions in my own work, and having to position myself oftentimes and having to negate these different agendas, if you wish, right? Because all of these different areas have agendas. As scholars or in research, then you have the political institutions, and then you have advocacy. And I think that's why it's so important that we try to open up spaces for discussion around this. And just a brief note, for instance, the project, right, that I'm working on right now, that I mentioned on gender apartheid and asylum, I was frankly surprised that this has not been explored before. I was frankly surprised to see that these two, the concept and the practice of gender apartheid with what we see actually happening in terms of asylum, particularly the court decision that I referenced, why are we not putting that into conversation? Why are we not looking into this more thoroughly and then seeing that on the advocacy side, this is actually being done, while the political institutions are kind of hesitant to use the term of gender apartheid. But then I see myself as, uniquely positioned as a scholar that operates in these three to say, let's talk about it. And I actually have an article that is titled, It's Time to Talk About Gender Apartheid and Asylum. And so I think I certainly see the tension. I experience it all the time, but I think we need more spaces where we can open up these discussions, but not in a way as seeing yes, acknowledging that there's different agendas at play, but what is the ultimate goal at the end? And is there a way that we can use the opportunities of all different fields together to move towards this common goal? And I'll leave it here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lara. Ziana, your hand was also up, so I wanted to check if you want to share something. Oops, I guess Ziana is not with us. Okay, so thank you so much, everyone. Thank you so much, Julia, for amazing job with the panel. Before we officially wrap up, I want to take a moment to express my deepest gratitude to all incredible speakers and for their powerful contributions, and to all of you for your engagement, thoughtful, questions and participation today. We know that virtual spaces are not always easy, so we truly appreciate everyone's patience with any technical struggles along the way. So a special thank to those joining from late evening, late night, or early morning time zones. Your commitment to being part of this conversation, despite these challenges, speaks volume about the urgency and importance of these issues. So today we've heard from lived experiences and academic research on gender apartheid in Afghanistan and Iran, gender equity, displacement, and the struggle of intersectional identities, particularly women of color in Canada. These conversations are not just about raising awareness, but also about mobilizing action and ensuring that no one is left behind. And as it has been famously said, while we have spent over a decade empowering our girls and women, we have often overlooked the need to educate men to understand, accept, and support that empowerment. True gender equity cannot be achieved unless we are all on the same page with a shared definition of empowerment. Education is a human right. Gender equity is non-negotiable. As we move forward, I encourage each of you to carry this conversation beyond today, whether that means amplifying these issues, advocating for policies that support education access, or standing in solidarity with women and girls who are fighting for their right to learn. As Dr. Funmi so powerfully said, we cannot blame customs for women's right to learn in 2025. Thank you again for being here and for being part of this movement. Wishing you all strength, solidarity, and action beyond today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.